You're at a birthday party, a wedding, a casual dinner with friends. Someone asks what you've been up to, and for a second, you freeze. Because the honest answer feels embarrassing. You're still figuring things out, still explaining the same answers you gave last year. So you smile and give a vague answer, something positive, but non-committal. And the whole time, there's this quiet voice in your head saying you should be further along by now. You should have more figured out. You should have achieved more, saved more, become more. You look around and everyone else seems to be moving forward, getting promotions, buying houses, getting married, having kids, building careers, and you're still here, still trying, still behind. If that feeling is familiar, if you've spent years feeling like you're running a race where everyone else got a head start, then you need to understand something. That feeling isn't about where you actually are. It's about how you're measuring progress, and the measuring stick you're using is probably broken. Today, we're going to talk about the psychology of feeling behind, why it happens, what it does to you, and why the timeline you think you're supposed to follow doesn't actually exist. Let's start with where this feeling comes from, because nobody's born thinking they're behind. You learn it, and you learn it early. You grow up in a world obsessed with milestones. Graduate at 18, college at 22, career by 25, marriage by 30, kids by 35. There's this invisible schedule that everyone seems to follow. And when you don't hit those markers at the expected time, you start to feel like something's wrong with you. Psychologists call this the social clock. It's the culturally expected timeline for major life events. And it's completely arbitrary. It varies by culture, by generation, by social class. But when you're inside it, it feels universal. It feels like the way things are supposed to be. And when your life doesn't match that timeline, you feel behind. Not because you're actually failing, but because you're comparing your real life to an imaginary schedule that was never designed for you in the first place. Here's what makes this worse. The social clock isn't just external, it gets internalized. You start carrying it around in your head. You start measuring yourself against it constantly. Every birthday becomes a reminder of what you haven't accomplished yet. Every milestone someone else hits becomes evidence that you're falling behind. And the longer you feel behind, the more it shapes how you see yourself. You stop seeing your life as unique. You start seeing it as deficient, as less than, as wrong. This is one of those things nobody teaches you. But feeling behind isn't about your actual progress. It's about the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. And that gap is almost always based on comparison, not reality. You're not behind because you're moving slowly. You're behind because everyone else looks like they're moving faster. There's a psychological concept called social comparison, and it's the root of most of this pain. You're constantly evaluating your progress by looking at others. Your coworker who got promoted, your sibling who bought a house, your friend who seems to have it all figured out. And every comparison reinforces the belief that you're not doing enough, that you're not where you're supposed to be, that somehow you missed the memo on how life works. You already know this intellectually, and yet it still hurts. That's because knowing it isn't the same as believing it. Your brain keeps running the comparison anyway, keeps showing you evidence that you're falling short, keeps reinforcing the story that everyone else figured out something you couldn't. And that comparison isn't just inaccurate, it's devastating, because it makes you feel like everyone else has something you're missing. Some secret, some advantage, some clarity about how to live that you just don't have. The truth is, most people feel behind, even the ones who look like they're ahead. Because feeling behind isn't about objective reality. It's about perception. And as long as you're measuring yourself against others, you'll always find someone who's further along. And here's the part nobody tells you. feeling behind doesn't just hurt. It quietly reshapes your entire life. When you feel behind, you start operating from scarcity instead of possibility. Every decision becomes about catching up instead of moving forward. You take jobs you don't want because they seem like progress. You rush into relationships because you're running out of time. You make choices based on where you think you should be, not where you actually want to go. And the irony is, this makes you feel even more behind, because you're living someone else's timeline instead of your own. You're chasing milestones that don't actually matter to you, and when you reach them, they don't bring the relief you expected. They just reveal another gap, another place where you're still not enough. There's also shame, deep, pervasive shame, because when you feel behind, you assume it's your fault, that you're not working hard enough, not smart enough, not disciplined enough, that everyone else figured out something you couldn't. And that shame doesn't motivate you. It erases you. It makes you hide. It makes you avoid situations where you might be exposed. It makes you lie about where you are, because the truth feels like failure. You stop going to reunions because you don't want to explain what you've been doing. You avoid certain conversations because you don't want to admit you're not where you thought you'd be. You shrink your life down to avoid the discomfort of being seen as behind. And yeah, it can be terrifying to admit that, but the shame isn't helping you move forward. It's keeping you trapped in a story about yourself that isn't even true. Here's another thing that happens. When you feel behind, you lose the ability to enjoy where you are. Every moment becomes provisional, temporary, a place you're just passing through on the way to where you're supposed to be. You can't celebrate small wins because they don't feel significant enough. You can't be present in your life because you're constantly focused on where you're not. You can't rest because rest feels like falling further behind. This creates a chronic state of anxiety. You're always bracing for the next comparison, always scanning for evidence that you're not measuring up, always waiting for someone to notice that you're a fraud who hasn't figured it out yet. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. It's when your nervous system is constantly activated, looking for threats. And when the threat is being behind, you never get to relax. Because there's always someone ahead. Always another milestone you haven't hit. Always another way you're not enough. And this is where it turns from uncomfortable to exhausting. Because feeling behind isn't just a thought. It's a physiological state. Your body is responding to a perceived threat. And when that threat never goes away, you burn out. You feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You feel stuck in a way that effort doesn't solve. You feel hopeless in a way that achievement doesn't remedy. Because the problem isn't what you're doing. It's how you're measuring. Let's talk about why some people feel more behind than others. Because it's not random. Certain factors make this feeling more intense. If you're someone who grew up with high expectations, you're more likely to feel behind. Because you internalize the message that your worth is tied to achievement, that love is conditional on performance, that being average is the same as being a failure. So you set impossible standards. And when you inevitably don't meet them, you interpret it as evidence that you're behind. Not that the standards were unrealistic, but that you're deficient. If you experienced instability growing up, you might also feel behind. Because you didn't get the same foundation others did. You were dealing with survival while others were building careers. You were managing crises while others were hitting milestones. And now, years later, you're playing catch-up, trying to build what others already have. And it feels unfair, because it is. But feeling behind doesn't acknowledge that. It just tells you that you should have done better anyway. Social media makes all of this exponentially worse, because it's a constant stream of other people's milestones, engagements, promotions, vacations, new homes, new businesses, new babies, and your brain processes each one as a data point. as evidence of where you should be, as proof that everyone else is moving forward while you're standing still. The algorithm doesn't help. It shows you people who are similar to you. Same age, same background, same city. And every post becomes a comparison that reinforces the feeling that you're behind. You see someone buy a house and suddenly your apartment feels inadequate. You see someone get promoted and suddenly your job feels small. You see someone get married and suddenly being single feels like failure. Not because anything actually changed in your life, but because the comparison shifted, and comparison is the thief of contentment. Here's what most people don't realize. The timeline you think you're behind on doesn't actually exist. It's a social construct, a collective agreement that certain things should happen at certain times. But it's not universal, it's not fixed, and it's not true. The idea that you should have your life figured out by 30 is a story, a narrative, a belief system that you inherited without questioning. And the reason you feel behind isn't because you're failing. It's because you're measuring yourself against a timeline that was never designed for your specific life, your specific challenges, your specific circumstances. When you were busy surviving, others were busy thriving. When you were figuring out who you are, others were following the script. When you were dealing with mental health, family issues, financial struggles, identity questions, others were hitting milestones. And none of that makes you behind. It makes you human, with a different path, a different pace, a different story. But our brains don't like different. They like comparison. They like ranking. They like knowing where we stand. And when we can't easily categorize ourselves as ahead, we default to assuming we're behind. So what do you do with this? Because awareness doesn't automatically fix the feeling. You can know intellectually that the timeline is made up and still feel the weight of it emotionally. The first step is questioning the milestones themselves. Not just the timeline, but the actual markers you're chasing. Do you actually want them? Or do you want them because you think you're supposed to? Do you want marriage? Or do you want the validation that comes with being chosen? Do you want kids? Or do you want proof that you're a real adult? Do you want a house? Or do you want the status symbol? Do you want a high-powered career? Or do you want to stop feeling ashamed at dinner parties? A lot of what we're chasing isn't actually what we want. It's what we think will finally make us feel like we're enough, like we're not behind anymore, like we're acceptable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Achievement doesn't fix inadequacy. It just reveals the next gap, the next way you're not measuring up. Because the problem was never the milestones. It was the belief that external markers determine your worth. You also have to start acknowledging what you have done, not in comparison to others, but in the context of your own life, the obstacles you've overcome, the growth you've experienced, the ways you've survived things that could have destroyed you. When you feel behind, you discount your progress. You look at where you are and only see the gap between here and where you think you should be. You don't see the distance between where you started and where you are now. And that distance matters, because you didn't start from the same place as everyone else. You didn't have the same resources, the same support, the same stability, the same privilege. And comparing your chapter 5 to someone else's chapter 20 isn't fair. It's not accurate, and it's not useful. There's also something called self-compassion that becomes essential here. It's the practice of treating yourself with kindness instead of judgment, of recognizing that struggling doesn't make you defective, that being behind on an arbitrary timeline doesn't mean you're failing at life. When you can hold your own pace with compassion instead of shame, the urgency starts to ease. The panic starts to quiet. The constant pressure to catch up starts to lift. Because you're not actually behind. You're just on a different path. And different isn't wrong. You also need to redefine what progress means. Because if progress is only measured by external milestones, you'll always feel inadequate. But if progress includes healing, learning, growing, understanding yourself, becoming more authentic, then you've probably made more progress than you realize. Progress isn't always visible. It's not always something you can post about or put on a resume. Sometimes progress is finally setting a boundary, finally leaving a toxic situation, finally choosing yourself, finally stopping the patterns that were destroying you. And that matters, even if it doesn't look impressive to anyone else. Here's the truth that's hard to hear. You might never feel caught up. Because as long as you're measuring yourself against others, there will always be someone ahead. Always another milestone, always another way you're not there yet. But you can stop caring, not because you're giving up, but because you're choosing a different metric. Internal instead of external, personal instead of comparative, meaningful instead of impressive. When you stop asking, am I where I should be, and start asking, am I moving toward what matters to me, everything shifts. The timeline stops mattering. The comparison stops hurting. The pressure stops crushing you. Because you're not playing their game anymore. You're building something that actually fits who you are instead of who you think you should be. And maybe that's not impressive to everyone else. Maybe it doesn't look like success from the outside. Maybe it doesn't hit the milestones at the expected times. But it's yours. And that's enough. The people who look like they're ahead aren't necessarily happier. They're not necessarily more fulfilled. They're just hitting different markers, following a different script. And often, they feel just as behind as you do, just in different ways. Because feeling behind isn't about your actual position. It's about the gap between who you are and who you think you should be. And as long as that gap exists, no amount of achievement will close it. The only thing that closes it is acceptance. Accepting that your path is yours, that your pace is valid, that your life doesn't have to look like anyone else's to be valuable. And yeah, that's easier said than done. Because the pressure is real, the comparisons are constant, the shame is deep. But every time you catch yourself thinking you're behind, you have a choice. You can believe the story, or you can question it. You can measure yourself against others, or you can measure yourself against your own values. You can keep chasing a timeline that was never yours. Or you can start building a life that actually is. Some people will never approve of your pace, and waiting for their permission is what keeps you stuck. Because at the end of the day, being behind is a story, a perspective, a way of interpreting your life that makes you feel small. But you're not small. You're not failing. You're not broken. You're just living at your own pace, on your own path. The question isn't whether you're behind. It's whether you're done letting someone else's timeline decide how you feel about your life.